So, any questions? Ilan? Yeah?
First, I'd like to comment on the Irish community, Northern Ireland community study. First of all, I'm commenting on the Northern Ireland community study, which I think, first of all, is a beautiful study, and I think in many ways answers some of the critiques that Masi just raised. I think one issue that that I think maybe we need to think about is whether living within these mixed communities creates the change that you described, or whether there's a self-selection process in which certain people gravitate towards these communities, and maybe certain communities are more open to accepting out-movements.
Yeah, definitely. Now, these, having talked to the people who are moving, we encountered a full range of motivations for doing so, and some of them were moving because that they had a fractured relationship from the previous community. Others were moving for more mundane reasons, and still had connections with the previous community, and the previous community was predisposing them to be nervous of their new community. So there was quite a range of different motivations, characteristics. They certainly were self-selecting. You certainly would not get a proportion of people living in a single identity community to even consider moving into a mixed community. But I guess our finding was that even with the self-selecting element there, people were apprehensive and nervous and predisposed towards negative contact. But it is a very good point. Just to follow up on that, there has been moves in Northern Ireland to effectively socially engineer residential mixing. This is in social housing. So to bring Catholics and Protestants together in shared housing. And that has created some difficulties, because it's voluntary, but there are a limited amount of choice, so people might be moving for reasons other than to mix, and so that creates some difficulties. Also, the local community sometimes react against having shared housing imposed upon them. So for those who don't want the mixing, having new residential developments in their areas dilutes their population and their political base, and this can be perceived as a threat. So certainly there are issues of self-selection and resistance where it's seen as non-voluntary.
Questions? You're speechless.
Yeah, question for Masi. You were talking about, I really appreciate bringing like a new perspective to the field. It was very, very exciting and engaging. And obviously you pass around your book, and looking at that as well, it really just, gives another sense of the same, persona that you bring into that, right? So why did you do it in that way? Why in a comic book? Like, that's obviously very, very innovative and new. What was the thought process behind that?
Lots of things. Thank you for the question. I guess I wanted to be consistent with my beliefs,
right?
in not just preach but also practice some of what I say. I get easily bored, and working with an artist actually really challenged me and my other co-author to actually say things very precisely, concisely, but also rely on a support structure of art. Art means you can illustrate things concisely, but also dramatically, and most importantly, it's suggestive. In that book, and especially if you study forgiveness, the last thing you want to do is to be prescriptive. There's a quote, I don't know who it's attributed to, but one of the most violent words in the English language is the word should. So anyone who tells you should forgive, or you should do this and that, I don't feel comfortable with that. So the art allowed us to be suggestive and let the reader arrive at the conclusion and strategies that will work for them. And the last thing is, I think increasingly, with technological advance, I battle that with my students sometimes as well, how much attention span do we have these days? I wanted to create something that, exactly, I wanted to create something that people could read in 10 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, but they could come back to. And it's one of the most joyful experience I've had over the last 2 years to create it. So I can highly recommend it to you guys. No, it's the approach, not the book. Thank you for clapping. Whoever was clapping.
Any other questions?
Maybe I can comment on Masi. Masi already knows that I disagree with him because I think that there's a misunderstanding of how science works, and you cannot expect every single experiment or every single study to have policy implications, but the idea is that you build it through many years, and then at the end you get to a body of knowledge that can be useful, and sometimes it is useful for policy, and sometimes it is useful, I think, for people. For example, I do recently this work on gender stuff, and I feel that when I teach it to students, I make them think. It's not necessarily that the next thing that they will do is that they change the way they distribute the household task, right? But it makes them think. That's the idea, and that's how you roll ideas. That's the way that you do it.
Does anyone want to respond to this? Go ahead. Let's create a dialogue. I mean, why? Yeah.
Let's involve also.
I was actually thinking about asking you about Massey's talk, and I come from, my background is from a sort of legal discipline. I'm a lawyer practicing. My sister is a lawyer with a PhD, so she doesn't consider herself a lawyer. And there's this constant conversation about this notion of the ivory tower and whether it is purist in its sort of philosophical form versus the application of really understanding, the background of, in my example, of legal discipline, legal philosophy, what's good, what's bad, what's right and wrong on the field versus, what's in the theoretical, the theoretical sort of world of academia. So just for all of the speakers, it'd be interesting to hear in the world of the social psychology if you, how you see yourself, if you really see yourself as sort of an ivory tower academic, or do you really see that your role is to change the way that we live on the ground?
Okay. So a couple of points, and thank you for that contribution. I guess born an Afghani, I was born in Afghanistan, and life expectation is 42. I'm 39, so I don't have much to go. So I guess I appreciate that you have to be patient with science, and there's a body of knowledge that needs to be built over time, and I accept that. And this is why I'm probably not as productive as my collaborators, because I prioritize quality. Not saying that everyone is productive, they're not doing quality. Sorry, that sounds too harsh, and I'm not trying to be judgmental. I can only speak for myself. The studies that I do, it's outside of the lab oftentimes, and it just provides messy data. It raises more questions than it can answer. I think the comeback I want to offer to Nulit is, what's stopping us from being connected to the world and in fact being inspired by what happens outside of our lab? So competitive victimhood, you may or may not be aware of it. I picked it up from the streets of Belfast, Northern Ireland, where each side was trying to convince me who is the bigger victim. Now, I took that into the lab, and I took that in other contexts and so forth. So my critique is about this kind of, education, sure, and incremental knowledge, but that could be a basis for rejection as well. Right? Your paper is only adding incremental knowledge, and as frustrating as it can be. So even science, in terms of how it runs, is not consistent. And you need to bring that earth-shattering thing in order to get published in certain things. I don't know. I think I want to change the world, and I'm totally aware of my limitation. And it is dismissed as naive pacifist, as all sorts of things I've been accused of. But that's who I want to be. And in that sense, it would be so super, super wrong for me to reside in an ivory tower.
A lot of the work that I do is based in social reality and working back. But I believe that is the nature of social psychology, it's an empirical discipline. You use methods to find out things you didn't know already. And I think that using a combination of methods to engage with people in their everyday lives, you very, very quickly find that their lived experience is much more complicated than has previously been considered in the literature, and that can enrich your theory. At the same time, then you've got to consider the audience that you want to speak to. And if you want to spend your time using alternative epistemologies, and there are a whole range of epistemologies within psychology beyond the scientific method, and you want to use in-depth, innovative, qualitative methods, you've got to appreciate that you are going to be speaking to a narrower audience within the discipline. Or, and this is even more dangerous, you're going to be doing bad sociology. So if you're not aware of how the methods are alternative epistemologies are used in different disciplines, you risk actually simply kicking against the mainstream for the sake of it and providing alternative knowledge that other disciplines can do better. So I don't think it's just as straightforward as methodological diversification, or in terms of engaging with social reality and using that as your touchstone. I think you have to have a nuanced approach based on an interdisciplinary awareness, as well as being flexibly aware of your social values.
I agree, and I'm essentially it's a more articulate version of what I would just say.
I think going back to the idea of building a structure of knowledge, or the body of knowledge, yes. But I think that once you make it, then you can reach wider audiences. So, for example, I was invited to give a talk at the police. And then it's not necessarily that now I speak to the head of the police and he introduces new policies based on the needs-based model, but I think I give them food for thought, and that's how I see my profession. And other projects, so the one I do with Gali, for example, we will examine German-Israeli delegations, right, or youth exchange projects, and we want to see whether including components of empowerment or components of mutual acceptance affect the outcomes of these programs. So I think that basic research can later be, if you do it in a rigorous way, it can then be applied to the field. So I don't see this dichotomy between the field and also ideas like that, like the needs-based model were introduced in restorative justice procedures, and they're testing them. But I'm not the person who does it, but once I think you create a good theory, if I may compliment myself, if the theory is good, then other people can take it and use it. So it's not necessarily that if you're doing basic research, it means that it's not applicable.